The Alpha King's pup bit a human sleeve. The hall fell silent as the Omega smiled back. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. Elena Hart stood near the edge of the Great Hall, close enough to hear every polished word, but far enough to be ignored. The way people often ignored quiet strength when it didn't announce itself. And the room itself felt vast, stretching nearly 100 feet from polished stone doors to the raised platform, where King Rowan Blackwood's seat waited beneath banners the color of winter steel. The air cool as if held at a careful 68 degrees despite the crowd, and Elena kept her hands folded, posture calm, eyes steady, knowing this hall judged first and listened later. Around her, murmurs flowed like a current, not loud, not kind, measured in glances and pauses, the kind that decided who mattered and who did not. And while officials in tailored coats shifted their weight and cleared their throats, Elena simply breathed, slow and even, as if she belonged to the quiet between words. At her side sat Ash, the Alpha King's pup, small enough to curl beneath the bench yet alert, ears flicking, eyes bright, a living spark of attention that no one considered important, because they mistook youth for insignificance, and Elena rested her fingers lightly on the stone beside him, not claiming, not directing, just present. The hall carried the scent of old cedar and fresh ink, the sound of boots against marble measured in inches, and somewhere a clock marked seconds like a heartbeat, and Elena noticed everything without reacting, the way she always had, learning early that composure could be a shield. She remembered the path that led here, the long corridors, the doors that closed softly behind her, the way respect was rationed like oxygen, and she chose not to reach for it. Not today. Ash lifted his head, sensing the shift before anyone else did, and Elena felt it too, a subtle tightening in the room, a presence moving closer, a sleeve brushing air where boundaries should have been, and still she did not step back. The hall waited, unaware of what it was about to learn, and Elena's mouth curved into the faintest smile, not defiant, not fearful, but certain, because some truths arrive quietly, carried not by speeches or raised voices, but by instinct, by stillness, by a calm that refuses to bend. And in that moment, as eyes began to turn and attention gathered like light before a storm, Elena Hart remained exactly where she was, grounded, unflinching, ready for the silence to speak. Elena felt the shift ripple through the room before anyone acknowledged it. A subtle tightening as conversation slowed and attention aligned toward a narrow path opening between polished benches, and she stayed still, shoulders relaxed, gaze forward, aware that stillness often unsettled those who expected retreat. The man approaching wore a tailored coat the color of slate, cuffs precise, posture practiced, his steps measured in careful inches, stopping a respectful 3 feet away, as if distance itself were a declaration. His voice carried a smooth courtesy that skimmed the surface of the hall, addressing the council without naming her, speaking about procedures and decorum and the importance of maintaining order during assemblies where tradition mattered, and Elena listened without reacting, because she had learned long ago that omission could be louder than accusation. Ash shifted at her side, a soft sound, not a warning, just awareness, and Elena lowered her hand, resting it near his shoulder, offering calm rather than command, her palm warm against the cool stone as the clock ticked again, counting seconds like a promise. Eyes moved, measuring her, weighing her presence as if it were a variable introduced too late, and she could sense the quiet calculations, the questions that formed and dissolved without speech. The man's words drifted closer, framed as concern, phrased as guidance, and Elena noticed the careful avoidance of her name, the way authority sometimes pretended not to see in order to control the narrative, and she allowed the moment to breathe. Ash lifted his head fully now, attention focused, ears forward, and Elena felt the gentle pull of instinct moving through him, not fear, not anger, simply recognition, and she did not interrupt it. The hall seemed to narrow, the space compressing as if walls leaned in to listen, and a murmur began, soft as fabric brushing fabric, speculation without substance, and Elena's expression remained unchanged, a calm that did not ask permission. The man paused, perhaps expecting her to step back or speak, and when she did neither, his glance flickered, searching for a cue that did not arrive. Somewhere near the dais, a chair shifted, wood against stone, a small sound that landed heavy in the quiet, and Elena sensed the presence above them, patient and watchful, the kind of authority that did not rush. Ash's focus sharpened, his small body aligning toward the movement at the edge of the path, and Elena felt the room hold its breath, the way a crowd does when it senses meaning before it understands it. She considered the years that had taught her restraint, the mornings measured in careful choices, the lessons learned in rooms smaller than this one, and she chose trust over apology. The man resumed speaking, his tone firm but measured, and Elena recognized the pattern, an attempt to restore balance without addressing the source of tension, and she remained silent, letting the space speak for her. Ash shifted closer, a half step, and Elena smiled, not wide, not defiant, just enough to acknowledge him, a signal of reassurance, and the effect was immediate, a ripple of attention drawn to the smallest movement. The hall's light caught on polished stone and glass, reflections bending toward them, and Elena felt no urge to explain herself, because explanations belong to those seeking permission. When the man finally stopped speaking, the silence did not break, it settled, and in that settled quiet, Elena understood that something had already changed, not with a gesture or a decree, but with the simple truth that composure could stand its ground, and that sometimes recognition arrived without being summoned. The quiet held, dense and deliberate, and then Ash moved, not in a rush, not with alarm, but with the simple certainty of a choice made without hesitation, stepping forward the length of his small body until he stood between Elena and the man in slate, his posture alert, tail still, eyes steady, and the effect was immediate, a collective pause that traveled outward like a held breath. Elena felt the change as clearly as if a door had closed, the temperature of attention shifting by a few degrees, and she did not move her hand, allowing Ash the space to decide, trusting the instinct that had never failed him. The man looked down, surprised, recalibrating, his practiced composure faltering just enough to be noticed, and he drew back half a step, careful, measured, aware now of an audience that had sharpened its focus. Ash leaned forward and caught the fabric at the edge of the sleeve with his teeth, not tearing, not pulling, simply holding, a quiet boundary expressed in the only language that mattered in that moment, and the hall fell into a deeper silence, the kind that did not ask questions. Elena felt no fear, only a calm recognition, and she rested her fingers on Ash's neck, a gentle touch, not to stop him, but to steady the air around them, and her smile appeared, soft and unhurried, a signal of assurance rather than challenge. The man froze, then eased his arm back slowly, allowing the fabric to slip free, his expression composed but alert, and he did not raise his voice, did not reach out, understanding at last that escalation would serve no one. Around them, heads turned fully now, eyes widening, calculations rewriting themselves in real time, and Elena could sense the shift in perception, the way assumptions rearranged when confronted by something undeniable. Ash released the sleeve and sat, posture straight, gaze forward, his task complete, and the simplicity of it struck the room harder than any speech. Elena's smile lingered, not triumphant, not indulgent, but kind, the kind that acknowledged a truth without pressing it into others, and she met the eyes of those watching without flinching. The man cleared his throat, beginning to speak again, then stopped, choosing silence instead, and in that choice the hall learned something it had not expected to learn today. Near the dais, movement drew attention, a measured rise, the scrape of a chair against stone, and Elena felt the presence above them align with the moment, not hurried, not reactive, but exact. King Rowan Blackwood stood, his height commanding without effort, his gaze steady as it settled on the scene below, taking in Ash, the man in slate, and finally Elena, and when his eyes met hers there was no surprise, only recognition, as if he had been waiting for the room to arrive where it now stood. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to finish its work, and Elena felt the weight of that restraint, the authority that did not need to announce itself. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, measured, carrying without strain, a simple acknowledgement that reframed everything without assigning blame or spectacle, and the hall accepted it because it had already agreed. Elena lowered her hand from Ash's neck, her smile fading into calm composure, and she stood exactly as she had before, unchanged in posture but newly understood. Ash leaned lightly against her leg, content, and the moment settled into memory, a quiet line drawn not with force, but with clarity, leaving the hall altered in a way that could not be undone. The hall resumed its rhythm with care, voices returning in measured tones as if sound itself had learned restraint, and Elena felt the attention settle into something steadier, less curious, more deliberate, the way a room behaves after it understands where the lines are drawn. King Rowan remained standing for a moment longer, his presence anchoring the space. Then he inclined his head slightly toward the council, a gesture that released the room without diminishing the clarity of what had been acknowledged. Elena did not look up at him immediately, not out of deference but out of balance, allowing the moment to land where it belonged, and when she finally lifted her gaze, it met his calmly, an exchange without performance. The man in slate adjusted his stance and stepped back into the margin of the gathering, his role recalibrated, and the council resumed its agenda with a renewed attention to phrasing, to boundaries, to the small cues that now carried larger meaning. Elena felt Ash press closer, his warmth familiar and grounding, and she brushed her fingers once along his shoulder, a quiet thank you, nothing more. The proceedings moved forward, items raised and set aside, decisions framed carefully, and Elena listened as she always did, noticing the cadence of authority, the places where words softened and where they did not, and she recognized a shift in how often eyes returned to her, no longer assessing, simply acknowledging. When a recess was called, the benches shifted and people stood, stretching legs and straightening coats, and the air loosened by degrees, conversation flowing again in respectful arcs. Elena remained where she was until the space cleared enough to move without interruption, then stepped into the aisle with Ash at her side, her pace unhurried, her path direct. As she passed, a few heads inclined, not bows, but recognition, subtle and sincere, and she returned none of it overtly, accepting without collecting. Near the doors, filtered daylight marked the edges of the stone, and Elena paused to take in the cooler air. The scent of rain hinted somewhere beyond the walls, a reminder of a world larger than halls and councils. A voice spoke her name, low and even, and she turned to see King Rowan a respectful distance away, no guards, no ceremony, only attention. He thanked her, not for the moment itself, but for the composure that allowed it to pass without harm or spectacle, his words plain, his tone unforced, and Elena listened, nodding once, understanding the weight behind simplicity. She did not explain Ash, did not justify her calm, because he did not ask, and in that restraint she felt a trust form, quiet and durable. He acknowledged Ash as well, a brief glance, a softening at the edges, and Ash responded by sitting squarely, composed, and the exchange felt complete. When they parted, it was without instruction or promise, just a shared understanding carried forward. Elena stepped through the doors into the corridor, the sound of the hall receding behind her, and she walked until the light shifted warmer and the stone gave way to open air. Outside, the courtyard stretched wide, nearly 200 feet across, flags lifting gently, and Elena paused, breathing fully for the first time since entering the hall. Ash trotted ahead a few steps, then turned back, checking, and she smiled again, smaller now, private, the kind that belongs to moments no one else needs to witness. She knew the change would ripple outward, slowly, unevenly, but inevitably, not because of what had happened, but because of how it had been met, and she continued on, steady, present, carrying nothing she did not need, leaving behind a silence that had learned to speak. The days that followed carried the quiet aftermath of recognition, the kind that reshapes routines without announcing itself, and Elena noticed it in small, measurable ways as she moved through the grounds, the courtyard paths spanning a few hundred feet, now feeling less crowded, the glances fewer but steadier, the conversations pausing with intention rather than curiosity. Ash stayed close, his presence a constant point of orientation, and Elena allowed the rhythm of walking to settle her thoughts, counting steps, noting the soft echo of shoes on stone, the flags overhead lifting and settling with a predictable cadence. Word traveled, not in dramatic retellings, but in careful summaries, stripped of embellishment, and that restraint told her more than rumor ever could. In the administrative wing, doors opened without delay, schedules adjusted with precision, and when Elena spoke, people listened without the habitual preface of doubt, a change subtle enough to be missed by anyone not trained to notice it. She did not press the advantage, because advantage sought attention, and attention invited correction, and instead she kept her pace even, her tone measured, trusting time to do what force never could. Ash attended sessions where he was permitted, sitting with composure that mirrored her own, and Elena sensed how his calm translated, how it softened edges before they could harden. King Rowan observed from a distance more often than not, his involvement marked by timing rather than proximity, and when he did speak with her, it was brief and specific, acknowledging outcomes rather than revisiting causes, a practice Elena appreciated because it left space for forward motion. One afternoon, as the sun angled lower and cast long lines across the courtyard, Elena paused near the reflecting pool, its surface broken only by a light breeze, and she considered the math of change, how a single moment could alter trajectories without adding weight. Ash watched the water, curious but controlled, and she smiled again, thinking of how composure could be taught without instruction. A messenger approached with a request, phrased as an invitation rather than a summons, and Elena accepted, not because she was compelled, but because the framing mattered, and when she arrived at the meeting room, the chairs were arranged with an awareness of space, distances set with intention, signaling respect without ceremony. The discussion that followed focused on coordination, on shared objectives measured in weeks and months, and Elena contributed where it made sense, declined where it did not, her boundaries clear and unremarkable. When the meeting concluded, there were no lingering questions, no need for reassurance, and that efficiency felt like progress. Later, walking the perimeter path that stretched nearly half a mile around the inner grounds, Elena reflected on the absence of resistance, how it often followed clarity, and she recognized the role silence had played, not as avoidance, but as structure. Ash trotted a few feet ahead, then matched her pace, attentive, and Elena felt a steadiness settle that did not depend on outcomes. As evening approached, lights warmed along the corridors, casting a glow that softened the stone, and Elena returned to her quarters with the sense of a day well aligned. She knew challenges would come, that recognition required maintenance, but she also knew the foundation had been set without compromise, and that knowledge allowed her to rest, trusting the quiet strength that had carried her this far to continue doing its work. Morning brought a steadier pace, the kind that followed adjustment rather than disruption, and Elena noticed how the grounds carried sound differently now, footsteps aligning instead of overlapping, voices measured without losing warmth, and she moved through the corridors with Ash at her side, her posture unchanged, her awareness widened. A briefing awaited in a smaller chamber set just off the main wing, the walk measuring a few hundred feet through filtered light and shadow, and Elena arrived precisely on time, finding the room arranged with clear sight lines and seats spaced to allow movement without crowding, a practical courtesy she recognized as intentional. The discussion centered on logistics, schedules measured in days and weeks, responsibilities assigned with clarity, and Elena contributed where her perspective aligned, listening more than she spoke, her attention anchored by the rhythm of collaboration. Ash remained settled near her chair, unobtrusive and alert, and she noticed how his calm presence smoothed transitions, how pauses shortened when uncertainty threatened to linger. Afterward, as participants dispersed, King Rowan joined her briefly in the corridor, his tone focused, acknowledging progress without revisiting origins, and he asked a single question about feasibility that invited precision rather than defense, which Elena provided plainly. He nodded once, satisfied, and they parted without ceremony, each returning to separate paths that nonetheless moved in parallel. The rest of the day unfolded in measured segments, site visits paced at a mile per hour to allow observation, notes exchanged without urgency, and Elena found satisfaction in the predictability, the way clarity reduced friction. In the afternoon, She paused at the outer parapet where the view stretched beyond the inner grounds, the horizon softened by haze, distances marked in miles rather than feet, and she reflected on the balance she had struck, how restraint had become a language others understood. Ash leaned against the stone, watching birds trace arcs overhead, and Elena felt the quiet companionship steady her breathing. A request arrived later, informal yet considered, asking her to advise on an upcoming assembly, and she agreed with conditions that set scope and limits, confident they would be honored. As evening approached, the temperature cooled into the low 70s, lights warming the stone corridors, and Elena returned to her quarters to review notes, her routine unchanged despite the recognition that now followed her steps. She wrote with precision, sentences complete and measured, mindful that clarity endured beyond moments. When night settled fully, she took a final walk along the inner loop, nearly half a mile of even ground, Ash trotting beside her, their pace unhurried. She considered how the hall's silence had matured into understanding, how a small boundary had recalibrated a system without strain, and she felt no need to defend it. The future remained open, structured but flexible, and Elena welcomed that balance, trusting the steady work ahead to reinforce what composure had begun. Returning indoors, she closed the door softly, content in the knowledge that quiet strength did not require repetition, only consistency, and that the path forward was clear because it had been allowed to be. The assembly convened under a calmer sky, light filtering through high windows and soft bands that traced the floor, and Elena arrived with Ash at her side, her steps unhurried, her attention grounded, aware that expectations now followed her without crowding. Seating adjusted subtly as people took their places, distances set with intention, and the room carried a readiness that did not depend on spectacle. Elena listened as the agenda unfolded, items sequenced with care, voices steady, and she noticed how pauses were allowed to complete rather than rushed, how clarity had become a shared value. When her turn came to speak, she kept her words plain and complete, outlining constraints, timelines measured in weeks, deliverables defined without flourish, and she declined proposals that stretched beyond scope with the same calm. She accepted those that fit, neither apologizing nor pressing. Ash settled near her chair, posture attentive, and his presence anchored the room in a way that required no acknowledgement. King Rowan observed from the dais, intervening only to align priorities, his comments brief and exact, and when he nodded at Elena's conclusions, it felt like confirmation rather than endorsement. A question arose that tested boundaries, framed carefully but pointed, and Elena answered without defensiveness, stating limits and reasons in full sentences, allowing silence to receive them, and the silence did, absorbing the truth without resistance. The meeting progressed efficiently, concluding on time, and as people stood, there was no scramble, only an orderly transition, the kind that signaled trust. In the corridor afterward, a few approached Elena with practical follow-ups, requests framed as collaboration, and she responded with schedules and conditions, committing where feasible and declining where necessary, her tone consistent. Ash trotted alongside her as she crossed the courtyard, the distance spanning nearly 200 feet, now marked by familiarity rather than scrutiny, and Elena felt the quiet satisfaction of alignment, the sense that systems worked best when not forced. Near the fountain, King Rowan joined her, not to revisit the assembly, but to discuss the next phase, measured in months, his questions precise, his listening attentive, and Elena offered her assessment without embellishment, naming risks and mitigations plainly. He agreed, adjusting one parameter, and they separated with a shared understanding that required no follow-up. As the afternoon warmed into the mid-70s, Elena walked the perimeter path, nearly half a mile of even stone, reflecting on how recognition had settled into routine, how the extraordinary had become ordinary without losing meaning. She considered the hall, the silence that had taught itself to speak, and she recognized the value of restraint renewed each day. Ash paused to watch the water move along the channel, then returned to her side, checking pace, and she smiled privately, appreciating the consistency that steadied them both. A notice arrived later confirming timelines and resources, concise and accurate, and Elena reviewed it, making small adjustments, satisfied with the precision. As evening approached, Lights warmed the corridors again, and Elena returned to her quarters to prepare for the days ahead, her routine unchanged, her confidence quiet. She wrote notes in full sentences, organized tasks, and set reminders measured in hours and days, trusting the process she had helped shape. When she stepped out once more under the early night sky, the grounds felt balanced, and Elena knew the work ahead would be steady rather than dramatic, meaningful rather than loud, and she welcomed it, carrying forward the calm that had made space for everything else. The next assembly gathered with an ease earned rather than imposed, the chamber lit evenly, the air cool and steady, and Elena took her place with Ash beside her, aware that anticipation had shifted from curiosity to expectation. The agenda moved briskly through confirmations and updates, each item concluding cleanly, and when the final points settled, King Rowan rose without haste, the sound of his chair marking the transition with quiet authority. He did not preface his words with ceremony, nor did he reference past moments, choosing instead a present focus that grounded the room. He spoke plainly, his voice carrying without effort, acknowledging the value of composure and governance, the necessity of boundaries maintained without escalation, and the effectiveness of clarity that allowed systems to function without friction. He named Elena once, without title or embellishment, recognizing her role in establishing those standards, and the simplicity of the acknowledgement held weight precisely because it avoided spectacle. The room received it in silence, not stunned, but aligned, and Elena felt no need to respond beyond meeting his gaze briefly, a nod exchange that concluded the matter without prolonging it. Ash remained still, posture attentive, and Elena sensed the ease that followed recognition properly placed. The king continued with a single directive that reframed responsibilities going forward, measured in months, defining collaboration and accountability in equal terms, and he closed with an instruction that required no enforcement because it was already understood. When he sat, the chamber resumed motion, notes taken, chairs shifting, and the atmosphere felt lighter without losing precision. Elena remained seated until the flow cleared, then stood and exited with Ash, her pace unchanged, her expression calm. In the corridor, the usual exchanges followed, practical and concise, and she responded with schedules and confirmations, maintaining the boundaries that had become customary. Outside, the courtyard stretched wide under a clear sky, flags lifting in a steady breeze, and Elena paused briefly, breathing in the openness, aware that acknowledgement had a settling effect when it was neither delayed nor dramatized. King Rowan joined her for a moment near the colonnade, confirming the next steps with a few precise questions, and Elena answered fully, her sentences complete, her estimates grounded. He accepted them without revision, signaling trust through restraint, and they parted without formality. As the afternoon warmed into the mid-70s, Elena walked the inner loop, nearly half a mile of even stone, reflecting on the efficiency of outcomes achieved without pressure. Ash trotted at her side, checking pace, then settling into it, and Elena smiled privately at the consistency that anchored them both. Notices arrived later confirming resources and timelines, accurate and succinct, and Elena reviewed them, making minor adjustments, satisfied with the alignment. As evening approached and lights warmed the corridors, she returned to her quarters to organize the days ahead, writing clearly, setting reminders measured in hours and days, confident in the process she had helped normalize. When she stepped out once more under the early night, the grounds felt balanced, the work ahead steady rather than dramatic, and Elena welcomed the clarity, knowing that recognition, properly given, was not an ending but a calibration that allowed everything else to proceed. The weeks settled into a rhythm that felt earned, the kind that does not rush to prove itself, and Elena moved through the grounds with Ash at her side, the paths familiar, the distances measured in steady steps rather than anticipation. The inner loop, nearly half a mile, became a daily marker of continuity, flags lifting and lowering with predictable grace, and she found comfort in how little needed to be said now. Systems held because they had been allowed to align, and people worked within them with a confidence that did not seek permission. Elena attended meetings as needed, offering clarity where it added value, and stepping back where it did not, her presence steady, her boundaries respected without reinforcement. Ash grew more assured with each passing day, his awareness expanding, his calm translating into the rooms they entered. And Elena noticed how his quiet attention softened the pace of others, inviting patience without request. King Rowan's involvement remained precise, appearing where alignment mattered most, receding where autonomy served better, and their exchanges stayed focused on outcomes measured in months rather than moments, an ending that felt like a beginning properly paced. One evening, as the sun dipped and cast long shadows across the courtyard, Elena paused near the colonnade, watching the light trace familiar lines, and she reflected on the silence that had changed everything, how it had not erased voices but tuned them. Ash sat beside her, posture relaxed, gaze following the movement of the air, and she rested her hand lightly on his shoulder. Content in the constancy they shared. Notices continued to arrive, concise and accurate, and Elena responded with the same care she had always practiced, maintaining the balance that made progress durable. When an assembly concluded ahead of schedule, she noted the efficiency without comment, understanding that success did not need applause. Later, walking back through the corridors as lights warmed the stone into a gentle glow, Elena felt the ease of belonging that came from alignment rather than concession, and she carried it without display. In her quarters, she reviewed the week, adjusting timelines measured in days, setting reminders that respected capacity, and she closed her notes with satisfaction grounded in clarity. The next morning arrived bright and temperate, the air in the low 70s, and Elena stepped outside to greet it, Ash bounding a few steps ahead before matching her pace, attentive and content. They crossed the courtyard together, the distance unchanged, the meaning transformed, and Elena understood that recognition, when placed correctly, did not elevate one above others, but leveled the field so work could proceed. As she reached the far gate, she looked back once, taking in the balanced motion of the grounds, the quiet coordination of people moving with purpose, and she smiled, not for the moment, but for the future it allowed. Turning forward, Elena continued on, steady and present, carrying the lesson that had guided her throughout, that strength could be gentle, that silence could speak, and that dignity, once acknowledged, did not need to be defended again.